Welcome to the Valley Politics History Interviews. I'm Terry Christensen. Back in the early days of Silicon Valley, we all thought the concentration of high-tech manufacturing here was great because it was clean industry, not the nasty old smokestack industry of cities in the Midwest and back east. Then, in the 1980s, we learned about toxics linking into our water table and cancer clusters. High-tech manufacturing wasn't so clean after all. Ted Smith, who was then a local attorney, stood up to take high-tech manufacturing on by founding the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition and organizing activists to demand better regulation. Against the odds and some very powerful corporations, they won. All of us, including tech workers, are healthier today because of Ted Smith and the Toxics Coalition. We aired our interview with Ted in 2017. Here it is in full. Ted Smith, founder of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start by hearing how you got to the Valley in the first place.
I moved to California in 1969. I came out here from Washington, D.C., where I'd been a VISTA volunteer, and I went to law school up at Stanford. And I moved to San Jose then in 1972 following law school. You
started your law practice here in the 70s then?
Yeah.
This is when we started to identify as Silicon Valley. People started to call it Silicon Valley. By 1980, there were 3,000 or so high-tech firms or electronics firms. It was not as high a tech as we know now. And in the late 70s, we started to realize some things about Silicon Valley that I want to read you a quote from Janet Gray Hayes. You'll be familiar with it.
Right.
So she was mayor of San Jose, as you know, and she famously said, "I remember being so happy that we were having clean industry come to our community. I remember thinking about the smokestacks at other industries around the country. I didn't expect this problem to erupt in our own community." So tell us what happened. When did you first become aware of what was going on?
Let me just say that somebody took that statement and said what they didn't realize is that they buried the smokestacks.
Oh.
What they did is they put the chemicals underground. Yeah. It was actually my wife, Mandy Hawes, who was involved with an early initiative called the Santa Clara Center for Occupational Safety and Health.
Mandy's also an attorney.
Yeah. And they started doing research on the so-called clean industry and discovered it was a chemical handling industry. And they actually were able to uncover a lot of that in the 70s. And they actually were able to identify through a hotline that they had for electronics workers that there were serious problems going on, serious health problems.
I guess what people may not be aware of is electronics workers then were actually doing manufacturing. They were assembling things. It wasn't software or in the cloud.
No, the reason we were called Silicon Valley was because the silicon chip industry was here, plus all the other kinds of manufacturing that went along with that. And so there were thousands and thousands of people, mostly young women, who were involved in the manufacturing of the electronic components. So anyway, they discovered that this was a serious problem, but and they even got some publicity in the San Jose Mercury News about these issues. But it wasn't until the chemicals actually got out of the tanks and into the drinking water supply that people began to pay attention.
So it was affecting the workers early on. They were dealing with it up close.
And as long as people could kind of separate that out and say, oh, I'm sorry for the workers, but it's not me. Once it was in the drinking water, all of a sudden it was, oh my God, that could be me. Now it's serious. And so that was the most important change in the dynamic of anything that had happened up until that point.
And how did you connect to all that?
I was still a lawyer at the time, trying to change the world by filing lawsuits and feeling that I was not working so well. And once the chemicals were found in the water, I realized that this was an opportunity to try to bring people together, to organize, to try to get some legislative solutions. And so we realized that in order to do that, we had to have a coalition of people, because we knew that by that time already the electronics industry was a very powerful interest. And so we put together the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition and got involved in a process which ended up as the Hazardous Materials Model Ordinance. And in 1983, that ordinance was passed throughout the whole valley. And one of the key provisions in it was the first right-to-know provision of any ordinance in the country. And what it said was that companies that were storing chemicals on site had to disclose that to the local fire departments, and that was public information. So all of a sudden, it was now going to be public information about which chemicals were being stored where and in what volumes. And that was a revolutionary breakthrough at the time, and that then became local law and then state law and eventually federal law.
We'll come back to that. I just want to take us back. So the leaks probably were starting to happen in 1978, 79.
Late 70s, early 80s.
People began to become aware of them in 1980, 81 or so.
81, I think, was the first time. The Regional Water Board got wind of this. They started asking the companies to start testing, because if it's underground, you can't see it. You don't know it's there. But once they made them start drilling wells and testing the groundwater, it turned out that virtually all the who's who in the high-tech industry had the same kind of problems.
And the coalition, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, was formed in 1982.
Yes.
Announced in 1982. You were, I think your title was chair or co-chair.
Something like that.
At the time, eventually you're executive director of the coalition. What's that mean, coalition? Who was in the coalition? What was it made up of?
Well, we tried to go as broad as we could, and so we started with the firefighters, who were really good allies, and they were the ones who were always on the front line. The labor unions, I'd worked closely with labor unions at the time. The local environmental groups, the Sierra Club.
Labor unions were just getting liberal around here at about that time.
It had been a
pretty
big
conservative
change
before.
Yes,
right?
that's right. There was a big change. Peter Cervantes Gauci was the
Yeah.
head of the Labor Council, and he became the president of our board. So it was a labor, environmental, but then also neighborhood groups. We had a number of neighborhood groups involved, and then public health was the other pillar. So we knew that we needed breadth as well as depth, and that's how we put it together.
And elected officials were responsive to this?
Very, yeah. And of course the electeds were as surprised as anybody else.
Yeah.
See, the industry had sold itself not only as a clean industry, but as a light industry. And so they got preferential zoning treatment. So the Fairchild plant, which was the first of the kind of the most notorious of the spill sites, it was directly across the street from a residential neighborhood. And if the city zoning people had realized what they were allowing, they would never have done that. I mean, the reason why most high-tech development now is in industrial parks is to keep it away from residential neighborhoods. But in those days, they just mixed it all together. So when there was a leak, it got immediately into the drinking water supply.
So the coalition pushed for the model ordinance that you described a moment ago. What were the challenges to getting that approved? It had to apply, I should just say, it had to apply to multiple entities, right? There are 15 cities in the valley, there's the county, there's unincorporated areas.
And because of the way we're set up here, you couldn't just pass one ordinance at the county level for everybody. Each city has its own jurisdiction. So you had to pass it at every single city. And everybody realized we had to do the same thing in every city so it wouldn't set up a competition between the cities. Everybody was afraid that somebody, and some people pointed at the city of Santa Clara, saying, oh, they're going to lowball everything. And if they lowball it, then they'll get all the new industry going there and we'll lose out. So they were very aware of that. So there was a lot of effort spent in developing in this, and it wasn't just a right to know ordinance, it was a storage ordinance, so that it required double containment of all tanks, and it required strict monitoring between the tanks. So there's a lot of retrofitting that had to go on, so it was going to cost money. But the industry, I think, was so shocked and frankly so embarrassed by what had happened that they realized that they had to do something dramatic in order to try to make up for what had happened.
So the Santa Clara Valley Manufacturing Group, founded by David Packard a few years before this, cooperated?
They were pretty cooperative, and some of the key companies, I remember Intel was very much involved in it, Hewlett-Packard was very much involved in it, and there were technical issues that we had to debate. You know, what list of chemicals are we going to use? What are the volumes that we're talking about? We can't be talking about a thimble, that kind of thing. But once it was decided that we needed to have a comprehensive ordinance that would apply to everybody, and we set the goals of what we wanted to accomplish, the rest of it was pretty businesslike. There was also, Joan Gallo was the city attorney in San Jose working on this, and she was really, really helpful. I mean, there were some really incredible people involved in that, because I think everybody knew at the time, we've got to do this, we've got to do it right, and we can't mess it up.
So the county, the regional model ordinance becomes the state law, essentially, and a couple of years later, federal law. So this county really led, and the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition really led the country on this.
Byron Scher was the guy who
senator.
took it up.
Yeah.
At the time, he was an assemblyman, and he took it to the California legislature. But it was a classic example, as a professor of political science knows. You start locally, and then you build it up. It's the bottom up. That's a perfect example of how you do policy. It happens rarely, in my opinion, but that one actually worked.
And grassroots.
And grassroots,
It actually
yeah.
came from the people and from
Right.
the community.
Right.
Ted, we're almost out of time, but I got to ask you, because I know you retired as executive director of the Toxics Coalition, but you didn't retire from your activism. So what have you been doing since retirement?
Well, we've been working with people in other parts of the U.S. who have been experiencing high-tech development with showing lessons learned, but mostly I've been working internationally now. The high-tech industry, as you know, has moved out. We don't have manufacturing
Yeah.
right now. It's in Asia and Latin America. So I spend a lot of time working with groups there saying, here's what we learned, here's what you need to know so that you can protect your own communities.
Are you getting traction there on these issues?
There's a lot of activity going on. Yeah, tremendous amount of young activists. It feels good to see, what things were like here 30 and 40 years ago being reproduced now in many parts of the world.
So you're still an unsung hero. The Dalai Lama recognized you as such.
He did.
He did. That must have been wonderful.
It was very nice, yeah.
Thanks for your conversation today, Ted.
Thank you, Terry.
For other interviews with the leaders and activists who shaped the history of San Jose and Santa Clara County, look for the Valley Politics History Interviews on YouTube. I'm Terry Christensen. Thanks for watching.